Go. Hello and welcome to this TNR Live conversation. I'm Laura Marsh, the literary editor of The New Republic, and I'm here with Alex Shephard, senior editor, Osita Nwanevu, contributing editor of The New Republic, and Mark Krotov, co-editor and publisher of N+1. We're here to talk about culture under the next Trump era. In the first Trump era, the president's presence was impossible to avoid in the arts. His first term saw a proliferation of books about Trump and his excesses, dozens of documentaries about his life and presidential administration, and even the appearance of Trump-like figures in novels. The Biden years saw a slow ebbing of Trump's dominance in popular culture, along with a promised return to normal. So the question that we are here to discuss is, with Trump's recent victory, what will the next 4 years hold for books and the arts? And I thought that I would just start, well, first I should start by saying thank you, Alex, Osita, and Mark, for agreeing to participate in what I hope will be a stimulating conversation, but also quite a grim discussion. And I thought that we could start by just looking back at that 2016 to 2020 period. What is your recollection of Trump era culture? Who wants to go first?
I can at least launch it, but I think that, in one way, culture was very reflective of the Trump era, and that it always felt extremely reactive and very immediate, I think, for the most part, even in kind of longer gestating things like fiction and film in particular, that it always kind of felt surface level, and like there was a kind of immediate crisis or sort of impulse to respond to this, horrifying, shocking, chaotic thing, and to try to reflect it. But that for the most part, I think, art and culture did not ever really get to the point where it could take a step back. And even sort of in the intervening 4 years, I don't think we got to that point either.
Yeah, when you say reactive, I think it's interesting to dwell on what you mean by that. And I think how I understand it is that culture usually operates at like some distance from the news. And during the Trump era, it got really, really close. So you would have like a news event and then a flurry of books and other cultural products that, like, more or less, I mean, were ripped from the headlines. Like, that's a long tradition, but I think that was such a large portion of the culture that was produced in those years that it's sort of exhausting, and it feels like it crowds out a lot of the kind of more reflective stuff that you're used to turning to culture for. Mark, I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, I don't mean to sort of, right away take a contrarian position. But I guess I wonder what exactly, I guess I'd be curious to kind of disambiguate culture a little bit. I think that like one thing almost everyone kind of saw and experienced was certainly the sense in which Trump in particular, Trump as a kind of news item was extremely inescapable. And that I think that like one thing, and sort of given Trump's inescapability, given the fact that that I think by most metrics we as like consumers of the arts were more exposed to to the inner and often uncensored thoughts of more creators of art than probably any consumers of art in history, in the sense that like more filmmakers had Twitter accounts, more novelists have Instagram accounts, more artists have accounts on social media that I'm not allowed to know about as a non-artist. And so I think that like, and then as it turned out, all these people who we, I think, not too naively turned to kind of give us some distance from kind of political immediacy and from a sense of, from the headlines, actually, like they're all like consuming the same shit too, right? And so I thought about this recently watching a clip of a podcast where before the election, where Quentin Tarantino was like making this like surprisingly kind of earnest and passionate case for Kamala. It was just very like eloquent, to the point. And that guy's politics are kind of complicated. It was just like a funny thing to see, and it's like the first Trump era was actually full of this kind of like of like the collapse of this kind of like boundary between I think between sort of like what would be construed as like a more traditional role for like the artist and their kind of like participation in the kind of discourse that we were all participating in. So I think that to me is like feels like inarguable, and I think tiresome in a way, because I'm like, no, I don't like whatever ex artist. I just want you to be like not I don't want you to see you on Twitter. I want to see you. But then I'm like, at the same time, when I think about, I don't know, just like making kind of like a list of movies to myself from the first Trump era, I think to me, like, I don't know, maybe the best movie that came out to my mind during the Trump years was Barry Jenkins's Beale Street, which I just think is this like unbelievable, subtle, beautiful thing, very like a politically engaged film, a film that's very much like made in the shadow of a kind of like contemporary conversation about mass incarceration, but also like self-consciously a period piece, and a very kind of classy one. That doesn't feel like a movie that's like suffused with this kind of like political density that we're talking about. And obviously there's going to be like a million exceptions in any direction, but I think it's just it maybe what I'm just saying is that I'd be eager to make a distinction between our sense of a kind of like frenetic political cultural period, and the actual fact that like, because art does move pretty slowly, even kind of bad art moves pretty slowly, that probably there's like a little more distance than it might have felt at the time.
Just to foreshadow a point that I, or maybe at least both of us, will make later. What is Barry Jenkins, director of If Beale Street Could Talk, working on right now?
Well, yes, perhaps I'm not the only one that read this very harrowing piece in Vulture this afternoon about the Mufasa. So maybe we'll get to that as a kind of late Bidenist nadir. But I'm sure we have time to talk about that.
Wait, since we've mentioned it now, can we explain what that is? Why is it?
Yes.
Yes. So Barry
Somehow
Jenkins, this extraordinary filmmaker of Moonlight and If Beale Street Could Talk, has been wrapped up making live action Lion King movie for the last several years.
Oh, that Mufasa. Okay.
That Mufasa. Yeah. And I think it sort of gets at just a very depressing turn in the way that art is made right now, but I think also I think could sort of prefigure a sort of turn towards more escapist entertainment in the sort of second Trump era.
We'll get back to the escapism thing, because that's on our agenda. But I think an important or an interesting point about If Beale Street Could Talk is, yes, it came out in 2018. It was probably in the works before the election. But it's an adaptation of a James Baldwin novel. So it does have this like real distance from the present, in that it's referencing something it's adapted from something that was written many years earlier. And I do see that as being different from what I think of as the real proliferation of like Trump response art. And I think in like the most sort of boring basic terms, the way I would at least characterize some of that is that, just as an editor of book reviews, when I look at the lists of what's coming out every season, beginning in 2016, you just get like such a huge shift in what is being released by publishers, where there are just many, many titles that are all devoted to explaining Trump. And of course, it's far from unusual for publishers to publish books about the president. Like we see that under every president. But I think that the sheer number about Trump, it's like enormously larger than anything you ever saw, like books about Obama, books about Biden, even books about George W. Bush. Like, it's just so disproportionate. And then on top of that, you have all the books that are devoted to understanding various tendencies that inform his politics or the people associated with him, to the point that the lists are very crowded by those titles. And some of the more surprising stuff, or just stuff that's like lies a little bit outside the news cycle, isn't really there anymore. And that to me, so what stands out to me about that period is a kind of a narrowing of the range of things the public is encouraged to be interested in.
Did you see that in fiction as well, Laura? Like, in, you know, when you were looking at catalogs, did you feel like fiction was also kind of like taking a more headline-oriented turn, or I mean, obviously that's like on a much longer delay, but I'm just curious.
I think fiction certainly has more distance from all of that than nonfiction, for sure. But I think, you know, you see books that I think are trying to connect to Trump and the Trump era, certainly appearing within a couple of years of, yes, as someone in the audience just commented, so many dystopias. Like we had a huge like dystopia cycle where editors were assigning all these essays about dystopias. And I think also you get novels like, this isn't a criticism of the novel, but novels like Hari Kunzru's Red Pill, which is all about the alt-right. I think certainly there was an appetite among publishers for books that, even works of fiction, that seem to speak to the moment in a very direct way. I would say that I think other fiction still prospered during that era, but one thing I think that fiction has really suffered, or did really suffer in those years, was just, again, a narrowing of attention, and the way that I think the media sort of shepherds people's attention towards the immediate and the surface level much more than it did pre-2016. So it's just harder to get coverage of novels to get attention compared to 8 years earlier. I think there are a number of factors and reasons for that have nothing to do with Trump, like the media ecosystem, the way that social media works, and so on. But I do think the fact that people are so absorbed with Trump definitely makes it harder to start a conversation about the big new novel that everyone's reading. When Alex and I were preparing for this panel, we were talking about the fall 2016 kind of big fiction releases, which like no one remembers now. But at the time, I remember it was pretty highly anticipated that like Michael Chabon had a new novel, and like Zadie Smith had Swing Time, and these were books that would have got a lot of attention, and there would have been conversations around them 1 year earlier. And in the shadow of the election, probably quite rightly, like no one wanted to talk about this. There's one subject that people are talking about, and it's Trump. So I think that fiction writers, even some of the most famous ones, have suffered from that.
So for me, I mean, I think that there are first and second order effects of Trump. Obviously, one of the important impacts is that people were talking directly about Trump and directly about politics in all kinds of ways. We're all going to be seeing bound copies of the Mueller report at used bookstores for the rest of our lives, you know? So that's one like very clear impact. But I also think that the Trump era saw this continuation and intensification of things that have been happening, not just in publishing, but across culture in the years immediately preceding him, which is this attention to identity politics, this attention to questions of race, sexual politics, a lot of personal essays, a lot of memoirs about identity. You know, I think that you can trace this, if you had to put a real marker on the timeline, 2014, Ferguson really, really shifted a lot in the culture, in journalism and outside journalism. And so I think that under Trump, you did see a kind of intensification of people writing narratives that aimed at talking about race in new ways, or highlighting things about race and sexuality that people thought had been under-discussed. This is paired with, obviously, a huge amount of internal tension and upheaval within the cultural industries, whether that's journalism or publishing. I think a lot of that was salutary and to the good. But I also think that in the last couple of years, we seem to have reached a point of cultural exhaustion on that front in many respects. I think people are asking questions now about the extent to which the voices that are being represented in these conversations are authentically a representative of the broader constituency that humanly speaking for, when you have a black writer or a black editor, is that necessarily somebody who is going to give you a portion of the black experience that matters to people outside of literary circles, or it seems true to people outside of literary circles? But I think that Trump opened the door to a lot in that realm. I mean, you had TV shows where they were, you know, doing depictions of the Tulsa race riots and so on. I mean, it was a huge kind of shift that I don't think is necessarily directly about Trump, but I think his election uh, probably helped bring about, and I think we're going to be wrestling with the after effects of that for some time.
Yeah, and I mean that feels intuitively right to me, and I think that to me one question about I think that like one of the it seems clear that like at kind of at every level of the culture industry, like maybe actually the most at the from the most corporatized versions have the most intense version of this, both because they are a little more responsive to public opinion, and also it's easier to change, like to kind of just hire new people when you're so big. I think that there was like, there was obviously like a response to like hiring, just kind of like to hiring more, maybe like to sort of changing one's like approach to diversity, I think like on the margins rather than in any kind of systematic fashion. But as a result of this, of course, like certain kinds of like cultural products just like came into being that would have been like quite unlikely, right? A decade earlier, like an HBO show about Tulsa, exactly. I think to me, one question about, about the next few years is actually like, I see, as you say, I think it's a mixed bag, but one kind of particular question to me is just what kind of retrenchment we're going to be looking at, even along, from a kind of pretty low high of whatever, of like, diversification as it is. A part of that is like probably some kind of like response to the broader exhaustion that you're talking about. But part of it is also the sense that like, if I have less than negative feelings for the Disney Corporation, and would like it to be nationalized. But I think that Disney's experience in Florida with Ron DeSantis was in a sense like I mean, ultimately they won, of course, but like at what price? And I think there has been like a quite explicit recognition, like at least like quite an explicit message to shareholders from the top of that corporation that like whatever got them into that mess is not going to be repeated again. And what of course got them into that mess as in this narrative is like a kind of flirtation with with like quote unquote wokeness, right? And so I just wonder what, and I basically I just think that like that happened in the Biden era. But now we're in a kind of like in a sort of national DeSantisification. I think that like there's the right is very interested in culture in superficial but loud ways. And I think that like if you are if you're a kind of corporate executive in culture, but even if you're just like a more solid noble actor in culture, you're going to be quite sensitive to loud voices yelling at you all the time. And
on that
trying
point with on that point with Disney, I think that like one of the sort of lowlights of the Trump era in multiple ways for me was the reaction to I think it was the second Star Wars reboot movie, the Rian Johnson one, which I didn't like for my own reasons. I know that Mark, you hated it for woke reasons, but
obviously, yeah. Like as a longtime Star Wars fan, finally it had become too woke for me.
But I think that to me marked the kind of emergence of like the gamer gatification of culture, that sort of there was this thing in I think 2013 or 2014 where right-wing zealots had kind of hijacked video game discourse and sort of said that we're accusing it of essentially being too woke or too focused on diversity and not enough on delivering the kinds of red meat that they were used to. And I think it was Sam Biddle and Gawker at the time wrote a really prescient piece basically arguing that this was the future of the culture war, and that has come to pass. So I think with those movies, what you saw was like a real targeted and cynical attack on simple things like casting a woman of color and having her do a bank heist. Um, but I think there's another element of it as well, which is that it was deemed successful because these movies were seen as being less financially successful than they were supposed to be. And I think that that's sort of reflective of a larger unrelated problem, which is just a kind of like larger cultural fragmentation. But you've seen voices on the right really kind of glom onto that and make the case that this is happening because of woke reasons and not just because of, this thing that we've all hold in our pocket, and it sort of keeps us divided into smaller and smaller groups. But I think that one of the things that stands out to me about the last Trump era, and that I think changes now, is that there were still some kind of stubbornly monocultural franchises out there. The Marvel movies, I think, being the biggest ones. I mean, those were films that I also did not. I don't think I could recount the plot of a single one, but I probably saw 3/4 of them in theaters. And that I think is missing right now. And I do think that that's one of the things that's interesting to me about this era compared to the last one, is that the sort of cultural things that do exist that kind of transcend cultural or political bounds aren't really there, except maybe Wicked Part 1, which I enjoyed.
Yeah, I
Also,
mean,
the Barbie movie was only 1 year ago.
Yeah, that's true.
Sorry, Osita, you should go ahead.
yeah, I mean, I do think it's important that people will tell you on the right that one of the reasons why Trump won this time around was because you had a kind of cultural oppression of kind of like downtrodden men who are seeing all of their precious cultural products being diversified in all these ways, and they're alienated by it and so on. I don't really think that that is true as an explanation for how this election shook out, but I do think it's important that the right has a cultural agenda, right? So they have a set of priorities that they would like to see enacted within American culture, and always have, going back, 67 years, beginning of the conservative movement. This has always been a kind of bugbear for them. Like the liberals control the culture. We might have all the political power in the world, but if we are seeing transgender people in good American America, that means that we've fundamentally living in a country that is oppressing us. And so they really, I think, are focused on the ways in which the cultures they see it is defective. And I've thought about the extent to which, on the flip side, it doesn't seem like liberals and the left have much of a cultural agenda for ourselves. We have politics here and culture is here, and then sometimes Beyonce does a rally for a candidate. And these are the places where they intersect. Whatever happens in Hollywood, whatever happens in the record industry, whatever happens in TV, that's kind of like in this other place. And I don't think that's right for like material reasons, political reasons, and cultural reasons. I mean, to Alex's point at the very beginning, we're living in a very kind of stultifying period of American popular culture in ways that are actually directly tied to the material conditions of culture workers right now. We've had these strikes over the last couple of years. We're having AI, upend various parts of the industry. It seems to me like these are all things that we should be thinking about on like a policy level, and also on a cultural level. To the extent that people out there, I think, do feel exhausted by the deadness of everything. Maybe that is one of the reasons why you seek out a Joe Rogan or any of these other people, not necessarily because you feel oppressed, but just because you feel bored, right? So if the major cultural works and major films every year are completely devoid of any kind of violence or sexuality or anything that like feels real and alive to you, and you should look for in other places for that kind of content. So I don't know. I think that there are ways in which like our dissatisfaction with this state of popular culture um, has a material basis, has material impacts, um, and also probably social and political impacts that we're not really thinking through beyond being despairing about Mufasa. I think Mufasa actually matters in a big way that we should take seriously. I mean, I think it would be good to come up with a set of policies or a set of initiatives aimed at revitalizing American popular culture and doing right by cultural workers. So that's
Yeah,
something I'm
The
thinking about a lot.
Mufasa Act is going to have like it's going to be an
Yeah.
abbreviation the same way the Patriot Act was, just to like keep our interesting filmmakers interesting. Yeah, I mean I think that like I think that have a lot of sympathy for thinking about culture in exactly that way. And the, yeah, I mean, I think the conditions for the conditions for kind of mass culture are just like pretty grim, even sort of like and kind of would be if this is one way in which I think the who wins this, who won the election we just had is actually like I think it's super, it's material for for popular culture in the sense of in the sense that I do think actually because the right has this agenda, there are going to be a lot of like culture workers, but also the people who run things who are going to be kind of very, very nervous about criticism in a way that, of course, they wouldn't be during under a Harris administration, but in other ways that like the conditions remain the same. I was thinking in preparation for this about Nepo baby discourse, which which I think I always thought was like pretty funny. And there have been Nepo babies for all time. But I think like where you kind of start to think, you start to like look at filmmakers and writers, and you're like, God, so many of these people are the children of other artists, right? And of course, like, well, why is that? And that in a way actually feels like quite connected to our kind of like to our sort of to an adjacent problem, which is like a kind of culture of hyper accreditation, right? Where you have to, where kind of like increasingly people have to put in all these years in order to in order to kind of like succeed at any kind of scale for the most part. That like and the anomalies are like increasingly the Nepo babies, right? So it's like if you want to skip the kind of like years of film school and the sort of dreary work, then it would help to be like, I don't know, Ethan Hawke's daughter or something. No disrespect, excellent actor. But I just think that those are kind of structural conditions that have only become more entrenched, and so we're in a situation where I do think that like in some ways, yeah, since we've been talking mostly about film, but like it does seem like the particular kind of Marvel boom that we experienced through really kind of in the Trump years, the late Obama years, the Trump years, and the kind of early Biden years has like, but it's bust, right? Like we that's just not coming back, even though there will be like more successes and there's stuff in the pipeline, but there's no guarantee right now that it's going to be replaced by something better, right? And in fact, like the structural conditions that have created Marvel are very much still there, and so we're going to be in a situation where for the foreseeable future, like the 70-hour-a-week work schedules of like VFX people frantically trying to remove Starbucks cups from Netflix originals that's the dominant mode, even if Marvel's not going to be like the brand, right?
Well, but to Osita's point about material conditions, like you could argue that the thing that killed Marvel wasn't just like a kind of failure of storytelling, which I think is part of it, or sort of post-Endgame lethargy, but actual the shift towards streaming, which was brought about by economic consolidation, right? That suddenly Marvel didn't have its own juice, even just as, or logic, just as a kind of like continuing episodic movie franchise. It had to exist to sell subscriptions to Disney Plus, right? And you've seen this with Star Wars and other things as well, that like these things get kind of cannibalized by essentially like shareholder value because they're intellectual property that has that. And I think that those things retained some form of excitement, or not, and maybe not novelty, but certainly like there was energy behind J.J. Abrams's very faithful shot-for-shot remake of A New Hope, whatever the first Star Wars thing was called. But like that is now, turned into 8 different shows that don't have a kind of clear purpose. And I think that one of the things that we've lost in those kind of mass cultural things is also just, I always love the sections in like the Rick Perlstein histories of the 70s and 80s, where he'll just have like 3 paragraphs that are just like, we're going to talk about trucker movies right now, and like how those explain this moment. And I think that what we've lost are a kind of like lower form of pop culture that feels reflective of the moment that we live in right now.
I
Might
think
be
as
so many.
well.
No, I was just going to say that there might be an entire series of to-be originals that are our era's trucker movies, and we just don't know. So it's before the next panel, we got to find out.
I think it's also interesting to note that the Trump years coincided with what's referred to as peak TV, this like boom in TV and filmmaking to some extent, where you have like a ton of private equity money, VC borrowing at low interest rates, going into streaming, and huge amounts of money being thrown at big budget stuff that's meant to appeal to as many people as possible. So you get like a proliferation of those kinds of projects, maybe not Marvel because that's, you know, Disney, but you get streamers trying to do these like big budget things that are just based on, they have to make money, so they have to work with really familiar IP and they have to try and appeal to like literally everyone. And I think if you see a decline in that recently or a feeling of exhaustion, it's also because there is way less TV. Like there's like empirically less TV and fewer movies now than there were 4 years ago. Lots of stuff has been mothballed, isn't getting made. Things have actually narrowed in that sense. And it's not clear. It's not clear if there will ever be as much again. Or if it will all just be that space, I think, for people who are looking for something to watch is being filled by short stuff on YouTube and TikTok and a lot of scrolling. So I think we have reviewed now kind of the first 4 years. And I think some of the main trends are there's a sort of inescapability, like Trump is everywhere, that it's hard to get away from him. I think some of the reactions to Trump on the social justice side, racial justice, and also the Me Too movement actually did bring about some positive changes in the culture and a slightly broader range of stuff getting paid attention to for a while. And then there's also this sense of kind of cultural exhaustion that we keep talking about. One other trend, I guess, too, is that Hollywood and the publishing industry seem like quite willing to openly align themselves with what you would call like the liberal resistance, at least at first. Looking ahead to 2024 to 2028, the next part of this discussion is like, what do we think will happen? What will be different? I think one thing we've already all kind of agreed on is that those corporations definitely are not going to be vocally anti-Trump or resistance-y going forward. They're either going to keep their mouths shut or, in fact, maybe try to pander to the right a little bit more.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. And I don't know that that's actually negative. I mean, I think that a lot of the resistance stuff was basically public relations for people who donated to Trump or, backed him other ways or who even just wanted him, even if they didn't say anything to be in office because they'd pay lower in taxes. I think that absence is going to be clarifying, or I hope it's clarifying for people that the Walt Disney Corporation is not a vehicle for social justice. Uh, but, beyond that kind of I don't know, demystification or sort of clarification of what the industry is actually about. I don't know that we get better art. I mean, I think one of the dumbest things people said uh, early on in Trump was, well, there's going to be a lot of great like resistance art on this basis. It's going to be like a revitalization of, punk rock music and all these different things because people are going to be so angry. First of all, I think that people feel less angry to me this time around than they did the first time, which worries me a little bit. I mean, I think that one of the things I keep saying to people now is basically as soon as the result came in 2016, I was inundated with DMs and emails and text messages about protests and rallies and teach-ins and sit-ins and this and that. And all of that seems to be, if it's happening, at a kind of simmer. Now that might change come January if we start seeing a real push at deportations once this becomes fully real in a policy way. And so maybe some of that resistance energy comes back up. But I kind of think that people are going to think more critically, or I hope they think more critically about what actual political resistance through arts can look like. Do you have to be didactic, or are there other ways, even within the aesthetics or form of something, that you can register your disapproval or your protest against the status quo? There's a great piece that Jacobin did, I think, a couple years ago about twee music. So these bands with like a superficially kind of like soft, color aesthetic, but they're actually like, there's a political radicalism um, in their message, but also in the adoption of those aesthetics as a rejection of what people thought punk rock had to be or could be. There's something about the way that they made their music that stood apart from everything else that was going on at the time. So even though it wasn't an abrasive aesthetic, it was still a kind of registration of some kind of disapproval with the status quo. Um, in that kind of way, I hope that people think more actively about the ways that form um, can be radical in and of itself. Um, just making something that doesn't look like it's being made by a corporation that donated is giving money to Donald Trump and inundating our culture with slop. That I feel like uh, can mean something. I don't think I would rely upon art ever to actually, you know, be in and of itself like meaningful political action. There's that famous Vonnegut quote, right, about the Vietnam War, where everybody's in attentions, all the cultural leaders of the moment were focused on opposing the Vietnam War, for an entire decade, and it didn't really do anything. Um, I have a lot of, I think, cynicism about art's capacity to actually enact change. Um, but I do think that we can, or I hope we can, um, produce better art for art's sake. And in doing that, I hope that we get to a place where we are organizing um, and bolstering the standing of creative workers um, in ways that materially improve their lives and also maybe hold its own political power. But beyond and outside of the actual artistic product itself, more unions are probably better for us politically moving forward. So.
Yeah, I agree with those points. One thing that I've been thinking about in over the last month is about the dullest topic of all, which is cable TV ratings. But I think one way of understanding the huge fall off in ratings for MSNBC and CNN is that when the Buffalo Bills lose, I listen to less football podcasts, and like liberals might just be tuned out because they lost. But I think another way of looking at it is that during the first Trump term, there was always this idea that the other shoe was about to drop, and that if you kind of like turned away for a second, you were going to miss, or if you didn't engage with this one piece, there was always a book or certainly a talking head on TV selling this idea that this was the thing that was going to undo this moment. And I think that one way, at least, of understanding the drop in those ratings is that there's been a kind of larger recognition that that's not going to happen, that this is not, that we're not just waiting for this one thing, that this is the larger reality that we have. And I think that, in terms of culture, that could actually be good because, I think so many of the films that we talk about that we've mentioned or that I loved in the last, during the first Trump era, I mean, Beale Street, but also things like Phantom Thread, which I think was 2017, or like First Reformed. These are not movies that that reckon in any way with the technological experience of the first Trump term, which was, like I was a, breaking news person, and I had a little thing go off on my phone, like whenever the president tweeted. And I think that that anxiety, I think, really reflected itself in culture that was afraid to reckon with this moment, in part because it could end at any moment, but also because it was shifting constantly, even though it never really changed. So the sort of hopeful thing that I have is that this is a moment where artists and cultural workers and people like me who have to, and well, all of us who have to think and write and edit pieces about this moment can kind of take a step back and actually reflect on it. That obviously takes time, but I think that that's the one area here that I feel hopeful about. The one area I don't feel hopeful is that I just think that one of the like quiet arguments to vote for Harris is that I think a Hollywood bailout in film and TV, like may be necessitated in the next 5 years. And there's absolutely no way that the Trump administration will do that, even with the 2026 Los Angeles Olympics on the horizon.
That's a really, yeah, that's a, yeah, right. It's like we were right in the first Trump term, we were all Louise Mensch, right? Just like waiting for the next, yeah, that feels, I think that's like a very accurate characterization of how sort of the news cycle felt like it functioned. And right, the news cycle, but also the culture cycle, in the sense that, right, the next Michael Wolff book will in fact be the thing, right? Though in this time around, I was like, Michael Wolff talking about Jeffrey Epstein being Trump's best friend, that really should have been the thing, but alas, maybe one day. But
Michael to, yeah.
Yeah, right. It's like, yeah, he just played both voices on the tapes. But I think that, yeah, I mean, this is like, it feels so anecdotal, but I think that Alex, you and I have talked about this before, and it's not a new thought, but I think one thing that was like clearly perceptible in recent years and preceded Trump, but just because we've been talking about film a lot, is that, some of the best filmmakers, some of our kind of most like accomplished, more, I think, particularly American problem, but where some of the kind of like most interesting and ambitious American filmmakers, and also sort of mass filmmakers in the sense of having means to pursue a certain kind of aesthetic vision, were only making, with very few exceptions, were just making period pieces. And you think about like the kind of like really the sort of like, whether it's Scorsese, whether it's even Moonlight is a period piece, but then like Underground Railroad and Beale Street are both period pieces, and Paul Thomas Anderson, it's just, you kind of go down the list, and with like pretty few exceptions, and I think that like you could say that part of why they were doing this is because modernity is very ugly. It's just like less, but another thing that it is it's I think there's like a certain part of what you're pointing to is like a kind of is, if we're living kind of moment to moment, breaking news headline to breaking news headline, there's also a sense in which like kind of the present tense becomes a little harder to capture and harder to assimilate. And it would be nice to think that that freed from that time scale, confident in the knowledge that things will just like get worse, but at a steady pace rather than a kind of like zigzag, that we might have, that art that is like a little more kind of attentive to the present, but in ways that don't feel like they have to catch up. I was thinking before our meeting that kind of the two films of the recent past that have stayed with me the most are Jafar Panahi's No Bears and David Fincher's The Killer. These are both kind of self-consciously very, very ugly, hostile, in some ways difficult films about kind of like visual technology and the present, and about people feeling, quite like oppressed by, the Fincher is kind of a stupid movie in some ways, but it also is just like, there's a lot of great stuff in The Killer where he just like, he takes stuff out of an Amazon locker, there's all these Netflix is in it. There's like all these brands in it, and it's a Netflix movie. So it kind of, in some ways sort of inherently looks like shit. And so, but thinking about these two films together, it's actually like it's like a marvelous thing to just have, the thing that one turns to for art, which is like a clear, highly subjective, brilliant, new interpretation of the present moment, right? Like on screen in front of you. And those felt like real anomalies, actually, to me, because I think that like most kind of major, I think it's like, I think in literature, things are not quite as past tense, though there's like some sense of that too. But it would be great to, not that I'm hopeful about much, but it would be great to think that like more filmmakers, more artists have a certain kind of permission to deal with the present, because we know that like the way that we were all engaging with the present, the first Trump term, is basically unsustainable from like a kind of like a timescale perspective.
Yeah, I don't expect to be optimistic, but I do think there is some hope that our relationship with breaking news and attention more generally is changing. I think that might be a silver lining of a sense of exhaustion. Because in 2016 to 2020, you have people like riveted to every Trump tweet, every Friday there would be some news drop, and we would be like be covering it into the weekend. And I think people did feel like they couldn't look away. And then that ebbed a little bit. But when you get COVID, it's straight back to that kind of attention economy where everyone's at home. And like, I certainly was guilty of like mostly being on Twitter, like from the moment I woke up to the moment I went to sleep, because I wasn't seeing anyone. And you want to find out, like, what do we know about how this virus spreads, like that we didn't know 10 minutes ago, right? And I think that relationship with the news and that allocation of your attention does have a real effect on what you can consume, like what culture you can make time for and enjoy, and how far you can step back from the present to read a novel, as sad as that may be. But I think in the last 4 years, the fragmentation of social media, and especially the downfall of Twitter, I think, or the lack of appetite many people now have to use it, is a good thing. And I think the way that my guess is that the way that we will relate to the news that happens in the second Trump administration will be slightly slower. I mean, I know, for instance, I think I don't know if any of us use Twitter anymore. I know, Osita, you got off like pretty long time ago. I think we all use social media very differently than we did 8 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I'm on and off just for like productivity reasons. But certainly in the last year and a half or so, the appeal of Twitter has been reduced substantially for me. I just think it's not as enjoyable and not as useful. One of the things I think about social media a lot though is for as much as we talk about the coming reign of short form video like TikTok and Reels, and that being one of the ways that young people, especially young people, are now engaged in the culture and making culture. I've been struck by the extent to which there does seem to be a space for sustained engagement with lengthy content. So like the binge watch, for instance, is one version of this, where you won't just watch one show, but one episode of a show, but you'll watch like 5 or 6 in one sitting. But also like, this proliferation of like video essays and like very, very long videos about like internet drama that people will actually, if not watch in one sitting, but like sort of like sit and watch over a course of like a week or so. It's like 4-hour video somebody did on like the Galactic Star Cruiser at Disney World. Like there's this kind of like, also on the flip side of the short form thing, like a kind of content now that is like almost indulgently long and dense. And part of the attraction is that you are willing to sit through it, for a sustained amount of time. And that gives me a lot of hope actually about the kinds of things people are going to be willing to watch and read in the future. I mean, the big film story of the year last year was Oppenheimer, right? So this long, largely black and white, dense biopic about a nuclear physicist and the Senate hearings that he went through. Like was not anybody's idea of a billion-dollar movie, but everybody saw that movie, and it was a big deal. I thought that was inspiring to me, even though I thought the movie itself was kind of so in many respects. So I don't know. I feel, partially because I think people are going to engage with the news in a different way, but partially because I think we also see these aspects of culture where people do seem to be into sustained engagement. I feel kind of optimistic about attention spans. I don't think that longer forms of art are necessarily going to go by the wayside.
It's not really not really something that we've discussed, but I guess I've been kind of fixated on a version of the opposite point, I guess, which is that, looking at Project 2025 and the sort of larger, which is whatever being enacted now anyways, but I think that there's been this long effort to intellectually backfill Trumpism, or to create policies around the like core pillars of tariffs and deportations. And that has like been pretty unsuccessful as a political project. It's going to get implemented, so it's successful in that way. But, as a political program, it doesn't seem like there's a huge constituency. But one area that I think has been successful successful on the right has been this idea of like culturally backfilling Trumpism, this kind of like hyper masculine, rambling, very mean-spirited approach to things. And I wrote a little bit about this in a piece about the kind of Trump dance that was sort of sweeping college and professional football games and soccer games after he won. But I think that you are also seeing a kind of rise of either very long form, so like Joe Rogan, kind of these like long podcasts of like kind of stupid people talking extemporaneously about things. But I think there's also been a rise of like sort of very short form, like essentially nihilistic cultural content on the right. Like the Nelk boys are like a great example of this. They're kind of like pranksters, but they do, they'll do things like be like, you've got a sign outside your house that says migrants are welcome here. So we're gonna, show up with 100 Latino people in a truck or something. And that I think has been like one of the more depressing parts of this for me. I think you can kind of quibble about how successful the like quote unquote manosphere was in electing Trump. But I think that one thing that does seem inarguable to me is that there's, a huge, even the Mark and I were talking about this the other day, even something like Yellowstone, right? Like these are in some ways traditional but updated American cultural products now. And I think that there's a huge array of them. And that was not the case like during the first term. So both, if you're an old person who lives, in suburban Des Moines, you can go watch Yellowstone and apparently not Horizon, the Kevin Costner film. But if you're, that person's grandchild or whatever, you also have an array of culture that codes as Trumpian without ever, while rarely being explicitly Trumpy. And also, sorry, just briefly, because I think Hale McSherry had a question as well about generative AI. I'm kind of a long-term, I've been shorting AI for a very long time, but I think one of the more interesting ways in which it's being used is as a kind of like aesthetic on the right, that most of the places that you see it, like Jared Polis, the governor of Colorado, like tweeted out a generative AI image the other day. And I was like, oh, it's very rare to see this from like a Democrat or an ostensible Democrat. But one of the things that I think has been fascinating about it is how it was utilized, for instance, like during the kind of like pet eating, fake story from the summer, or the Peanut the squirrel situation.
Which we won't ask you to explain.
No.
Yeah,
so
we
the
should
question,
leave that sentence exactly how it is.
Didn't even mention that it happened in my hometown.
he does have a great explainer of the Peanut the squirrel situation, but that would be at some like a subscriber elite level. We just can't do it here. The question was from the audience: do you think generative AI technologies will have a lasting impact on cultural input, or will it fizzle out like NFTs and the metaverse? And I do think that's a really good question, because I don't think it's like NFTs and the metaverse. Like I think it's here to stay. But I think the point Alex made is I agree 100%. It's already being associated with kind of fake news and the deliberate degradation of the discourse that the right encourages, because it's good to just sow disbelief and sort of cheap meanness. I also think, though, it links into my earlier point about a lot of people stepping back from social media. And I think there's a silver lining there, which is that social media is so full of AI slop that it just sends you, I think for a certain kind of person, like certainly for me, it just sends me away. Like everyone has a story about this, and Max Reed, who has an amazing newsletter about technology, has written about AI slop a lot. But like my version of this is whenever I open Facebook, all I get is like fake Kate Middleton photos, like really sentimentalized photos of Kate Middleton, and like with captions about how gorgeous and incredible and graceful she is. And I'm just like, this is not what I signed up to Facebook for in 2007. Just leaving right away, and like I'm gonna go pick up a novel, because I think when you're confronted with this such brazenly fake and degraded stuff, it's very easy to get off. Like, I think the sort of addictive power of social media has been broken somewhat, where you're like, this isn't like the cheap candy fix anymore. This is like actual garbage, and I don't like it. Like, I don't even, it's not a love hate, I just don't like it now. So I think like my concluding thought, and all of us should try to have a last word on this, but my concluding thought about what I think could happen in this next 4 years, and best case scenario would happen, is that people who are in a position to promote culture and to shepherd other people towards it need to have more confidence in their own sense of what's interesting and worthwhile. So instead of trying to react to like what we think the Facebook algorithm will like promote to people, or people will share on Twitter, both of which are completely irrelevant now, we should make decisions about what's genuinely interesting and worthwhile, and what our readers would enjoy knowing about, and what would, all the things we go to art for for its own sake. As Osita said earlier, we should be showing more confidence in those things, instead of being like, oh, this novel is kind of about Trump, so like, let's cover that. I think we have to pull away from that kind of relationship with sort of 2010s era attention economy.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think the role of the critic is maybe more important now than ever, although critics are always saying this. But you know, like when we're inundated by so much nonsense and crap, and we only have so much time in our lives to dedicate to art. It's important for people to stand out there as guides to what, as Laura was saying, is interesting and worthwhile, and not to sort of passively let the Walt Disney Company or Spotify tell you what's interesting. That's a form of robbery, you know, and it's letting this realm of life and the way you engage with it be dictated by capital, in a way I think that we should all find really and troubling. So yeah, I would agree that the extent that we can do anything ourselves as writers, I think it's important to, you know, not just chase headlines and not just chase the outrage of the moment, but to find whatever is out there that's still interesting and seems boundary pushing and novel.
Yeah, I think on that point as well, I think one of the biggest critical sins of the Trump era was in always trying to attach a kind of political significance. You know, I think because everyone was so locked in on what was happening, that there was this drive, particularly among TV critics. I will hold my tongue about that, but that to make the case that you know, that these were it was essential to watch this, that this was a way to understand this, that this would somehow illuminate the present moment, and it was just like not really true. And you know, I think it was just not. I think to the extent that peak TV was ever a real thing, it was over by 2017, and I think that the hope here is that there will be more of a sort of transition away from that. You know, my worry is just that you know, I think that that so much of that profession is just dictated by you know, I was just looking for something to watch, and it was just everything was about some Star Wars show that had just come out starring Jude Law, I guess. And I think that, you know, that there's just this sort of, it's so hard to target things that you just kind of end up falling back on these kind of franchise products. But I think that, you know, people like Phil Masiak and the New Republic and others, I think, do a good job of getting beyond that. But it sort of needs to be a larger industry-wide shift.
Yeah, I think. Oh well, first there was a great line in the Q&A. It said, "Could Krotov say more about modernity being ugly?" It's a beautiful question. I'm going to put a link in the chat. This is a piece that I co-wrote with our N+1's co-editor Lisa Borst that actually answers this question in a few thousand words. I'm very biased, but I recommend it. Yeah, I mean, I think that I don't have I have a lot of like structural hopelessness, in the sense that I think that we just like you know, I think we live under the shadow of David Zaslav and other total hacks and mediocrities, you know, and this just in some ways it's always been the case, and in other ways I think David Zaslav is maybe the most stupid person who's ever lived, you know, who's to say. And so I think that like in a kind of structural sense, it's going to be hard to you know, we're in a position in the short term of like hoping for anomalies, you know. But I will say that I think the flip side is that like the anomalies are always there. I think Osita's example of Oppenheimer is like an excellent and well taken one, right at the highest level of like you know, scale and commercial success. But also, you know, as an editor, I deal with like all kinds of anomalies all the time that we, you know, try to publish in our magazine. And then there are all kinds of, you know, anomalous books too that like make life worth living. And I think that like yeah, I mean, I think I would feel really hopeless if I felt that there was no hunger for that anomaly. Then I would like be in full despair. But I think actually, like, you know, as ever, we're kind of in this situation where yeah, where the kind of where the stewards of the, you know, the kind of like the stewards of the culture industry are in some sense getting in the way. I think that this speaks to why, yeah, I mean, I think that we've kind of touched on in a couple of ways this like the kind of the culture of like yeah, the sort of YouTube culture and like and you know, sort of like fan-made videos and why and podcasting and so on, like clearly key to that. Key to the appeal there is a certain kind of authenticity, a certain kind of direct engagement, right? Like to me, that has real limits because that's like actually not what I want from art. I want like an additional level of like creation and imagination. You know, if I wanted something direct, I could just like call Alex up and we could talk. But so anytime. But having said that, like there's like a clear yeah, there's just like a clear takeaway, I think, from that fact that people want to, yeah, people kind of want to deal with the present in various ways. They don't want to, you know, increasingly, I think they don't want to deal with them in these kinds of like tired, hackish, boorish mainstream ways. And the role of critics, editors, and artists themselves, I think, is to try to like create more opportunity for people to sort of engage with the present in ways that feel you know, implicating and intimate, but also ambitious, right? I mean, I think ambition is like one thing that you really don't get from like a 3-hour YouTube video about like you know, responding to like to a video game. And I don't really mean that like just derisively, because that's like not what people are turning to it for. But ambition is important, you know.
Well, I feel more optimistic after this conversation and surprised in various ways than I did at the beginning. Thank you so much, Mark Krotov, Alex Shephard, and Osita Nwanevu for joining us. We are slightly over time, so I'm going to end things here. And thank you to everyone in the audience who showed up. Please read New Republic, N+1, the many writings of Osita, which appear also in The Guardian, and he has a book coming out in the next year. Thanks so much for joining us.